February 7th, and this is 5 on 20 News, where the news is hot off the press and the newscasters have been let off the chain. With Ania Quintella
and Saida Olivier. First, for local headlines.
Representatives at Veterans Affairs in Arizona are worried that Trump's freeze will cause even bigger problems at the agency. Donald Trump signed the freeze into law yesterday, creating confusion for the Department of Veterans Affairs around the country. And the Phoenix VA is especially vulnerable since they came under national scrutiny when it was found that the agency suffered from long waiting lists and workers were lying about the patient wait times. Marilyn Park, who represents the American Federation of Government Employees, says that the hiring freeze will only make the waiting list longer. And that makes sense. Less employees means less people to assist veterans. Paul Capod, an official at the Phoenix VA, says that they'll have to make do with what they have and that he's looking into getting an exemption for the 50 or so current job openings at the agency. Right now, there are about 500 federal job openings in Arizona, with more than 300 in the Departments of Defense, Health and Human Services, and Veterans Affairs. Various government agencies have already received exemptions for police, firefighters, and post office workers. And all of this has prompted some on the right to criticize Donald Trump's hiring freeze. Dan Mitchell, a senior fellow at the conservative Cato Institute, thinks that the hiring freeze is more symbolic than anything else because a massive number of exemptions have been given. He says that the freeze will do nothing to shrink the size of government and is only a short-term band-aid for the bigger problem of a bloated federal bureaucracy. In response, Donald Trump called for a hiring freeze at the Cato Institute, particularly for people named Dan.
Mirroring a national trend, abortions in Arizona decreased from 2011 to 2015. There are no numbers yet for 2016 abortion rates. There were 12,479 abortions in 2015, averaging out to about 9.5 abortions per 1,000 women of childbearing age in our state. Rachel Jones, a research scientist at the Guttmacher Institute, says that the drop is due to women having less unintended pregnancies because of better access to contraceptives. Others credit the drop to targeted restrictions to abortion providers, or TRAP laws, that make it more difficult for abortion facilities to operate around the country. The report showed that non-Hispanic white women had the highest number of abortions, with 5,378 in 2015. And women between the ages of 20 and 24 years old have the highest rates of abortion in Arizona. Jody Liggett, Vice President of Public Affairs at the Arizona chapter of Planned Parenthood, was happy to hear the numbers. She says that the organizations like Planned Parenthood are there to make sure women can have healthy, secure lives. Liggett says if the Trump administration continues to target Planned Parenthood, their actions could backfire on pro-life groups because the rate of women getting abortions could rise during Trump's term instead of falling like they have for the several years in a row. Pro-life groups said this is fine because they're running out of people to threaten with eternal hellfire and need a new supply.
A state law that would raise the legal age to buy cigarettes to 21 years old looks like it may pass. HB 2335, which was sponsored by Republican Representative Paul Boyer, cleared the House Health Committee on Monday. The law also includes electronic cigarettes and vaporizers. It was inspired by a similar law that passed in the town of Cottonwood. California and Hawaii have also passed similar laws. Republican Jay Lawrence of Scottsdale opposes the bill because he feels that the law provides too much government interference, while Democrat Tony Navarrete is opposed because he thinks that the state's smoke shops would suffer. The bill will next move on to the House Commerce Committee, where the law is expected to pass. Heroin will still be available to state residents of all ages.
In an interview on KTAR Radio's Mac and Gatos show, Governor Doug Ducey got to use his radio voice, excitingly announcing that Arizona will not have any sanctuary cities. His statement comes a week after citizens delivered a petition to the Phoenix City Council requesting a vote on the subject. Phoenix Mayor Greg Stanton said that if the council votes on February 15th to become a sanctuary city, then they would be violating the law. While there is no strict definition of a sanctuary city, Ducey defined the term as an area that does not comply with federal law. He also expressed support for Donald Trump's Muslim ban, saying that it will do a better job of screening so that citizens are safe. He also said that the order is temporary and that he hopes to be part of the refugee replacement process in the future. Following his quasi-hate speech, Ducey joined Mac and Gatos for their daily crank segment, with the governor making a prank call to a Scottsdale woman pretending to be a Border Patrol agent rounding up illegal and legal immigrants. Things turned out sour when the woman began crying, and a nervous Ducey spent the next 5 minutes trying to calm her down.
Attorney General Mark Brnovich wants to make Arizona the first state to enact laws limiting law enforcement's use of tracking cell phones. A law crafted by the Attorney General's office would require that local police to get a search warrant before using a device called Stingray, which can track individual cell phones. Mia Garcia, a spokeswoman for the AG's office, said that the law will promote individual privacy and help the police keep the community safe. Will Guyona of the ACLU's Arizona chapter agrees. He says that it's a step in the right direction for police transparency. The ACLU fought a court battle against the city of Tucson, demanding to know how the Stingray program works. But the case ended with the Court of Appeals ruling that Tucson and other cities do not need to tell the public about the program. Since then, we've learned a little bit about how Stingray works by honing into a phone's electronic signal and logging into the nearest cell phone tower. This allows police to track the phone, but also allows other unrelated phones to be tracked. While Garcia said that the program is important to battle drug trafficking, terrorism, and child abduction, the Attorney General thinks that the public has a right to know when their phones are being tracked. If the law passes, the warrants would last for 60 days and would be eligible for multiple extensions if needed. Police would also need to notify the owner of the phone being tracked within 10 days of when the tracking ends, although they could get an extension from a judge. But the judge gave no decision on whether the Attorney General's Friday night Stingray listening parties would still be allowed.
An artist's installation caused confusion yesterday as drivers along I-10 encountered an old space capsule on the side of the road. Artist Jack Millard, who took an old concrete truck tumbler and recreated it to look like a space capsule that fell from the sky, complete with a parachute, created the figure. Millard said he got permission from the landowner to create the piece and began making it on February 2nd. The Arizona Department of Public Safety tweeted out a message telling the public that the project caused quite a stir. Millard said that he hoped people would enjoy the piece but didn't have any specific expectations. He said that we live in a cynical, jaded world, and if people were distracted for just a moment, then that's a wonderful thing. The cynical, jaded public agreed and now requests that Millard build a new art installation so that they can forget that they're living through the apocalypse in slow motion.
And I wanted to take a moment to talk to you about the program you're watching right now. Here at 5 on 20, we are undertaking a new kind of citizen journalism. We're going to give you the news as we see it, and we want more people to speak up with us. We need writers, hosts, anchors, camera people, sound people, the whole gamut. The times require a new way of informing ourselves. So join us. Do it. Do it now. Email us at info@creativetucson.org to get involved. And if you think there's a story that we're missing, a person we should interview, an upcoming event that we should cover, or have any news tips for us, shoot an email to info@creativetucson.org. We're here for you, and we want to cover all stories from all points of views. So don't be strangers. Now in national and international news.
4 Republican lawmakers are trying to make the EPA a thing of the past through a bill that eliminates the agency. Republican Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida introduced H.R. 861, which would close up the EPA by the end of 2018. Republicans Barry Loudermilk and Thomas Massie and also Stephen Palazzo, who all are opposed to the environmental regulations intended to fight climate change, co-sponsored the legislation. Gaetz is a freshman lawmaker who was quoted in a leaked document as saying that Americans are drowning in regulations enforced by the EPA. He says that to better protect the environment, we should abolish the EPA and revert the cost savings to states for more efficient protection. This isn't Gaetz's first rodeo with the EPA, as he has sought to repeal a state law that required a certain amount of ethanol added to gasoline. Loudermilk has been a regular on the Smash the EPA scene. He's co-sponsored nearly a dozen bills that reverse various environmental laws, including one that would have eliminated renewable fuel standards outlined in the Clean Air Act.
And this week, the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will convene for what they're calling Make the EPA Great Again, which is both a terrible name and inaccurate. At the hearing, the committee will revisit the Secret Science Reform Act, which limits the EPA to only using data that can be replicated or made available for independent analysis. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, it's not. Many of the EPA's studies rely on private information, such as health records, which can't legally be released to the public. If the act is taken up, then these types of studies wouldn't be allowed. The same for studies involving one-time events, such as the Gulf oil spill, because they can't be replicated unless we decide to spill oil in the ocean in the name of science. But that might happen anyway if Republicans in Congress get their way. The headlining act on Tuesday will be a lawyer named Jeffrey Holmstead, who has worked for years to block EPA efforts in limiting mercury pollution on behalf of giant energy companies, such as Duke Energy and the Southern Company. Senator Lamar Smith will also speak at the meeting. Smith is the energy industry's favorite prostitute who gets his pockets lined each election cycle by friends like the Koch brothers. When the Secret Science Reform Act was originally presented in 2015, Senator Bernie Sanders called it laughable, and President Obama said that he would veto the bill. Now that the foxes are guarding the hen's house, it's become more likely that we'll see a weakening of the EPA and environmental regulations as a whole. It's probably not a surprise that the legal team behind the bill, the Energy and Environmental Legal Institute, cut their teeth working on behalf of the tobacco industry. They are using similar tactics as the tobacco industry, where government studies were called into question, while inaccurate, biased, independent studies were given the same amount of attention. By delegitimizing the government-funded science, the group hopes to spread more of those alternative facts. If the group is successful, in 5 years, respiratory distress syndrome will be known as demon's breath, an ailment caused by voting for Democrats.
A new detention center in Texas is raising questions about a separate, isolated facility for transgender inmates. 36 beds are reserved for trans individuals, which the center claims is for their protection. But a Human Rights Watch report says that the many are kept in solitary confinement, further traumatizing a group of people who already faced abuse back in their home countries. In 2015, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, issued guidance to improve the conditions for transgender people, which included preferences for housing. Prairieland, the Texas Detention Center, is the second in the country that features a separate facility for trans individuals. ICE said that there are 55 trans people who are currently held in detention, and that the agency is committed to providing a respectful, safe, and secure environment for all of its detainees. They hope to avoid situations such as that of Ashala Ortega, an inmate from Mexico who was placed in solitary confinement because she felt uncomfortable being housed with men. Andrea Aguilar, an attorney from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, worries that trans people will feel stigmatized by having to be in a separate area of the prison, and that it may move certain inmates away from their lawyers. Aguilar says that the detention center as a whole doesn't work well, and that it would be much more cost-effective to provide the immigrants with GPS ankle bracelets while they await a hearing. Instead, Donald Trump has suggested erecting individual 7-foot walls around each immigrant, which would cost around $7 trillion to taxpayers.
With the latest flurry of Trump's executive orders, it's hard to keep up. For example, a lesser reported order would allow financial advisors to ignore the so-called fiduciary rule in regards to retirement plans like 401ks. The fiduciary rule requires financial advisors to operate with their clients' best interest in mind rather than referring their clients to more high-cost, high-risk products. These higher-cost plans often net the advisors more in kickbacks and perks. The rule was established by the Obama administration, who found that the conflicts of interest caused retirement savers about $17 billion per year, although Forbes magazine has questioned the figure. The rule was to go into effect in April, but the order directed the Labor Department to review the rule, which basically means that it's dead in the water. Gary Cohn, who was nominated by Trump to be the director of the National Economic Council, says that the fiduciary rule is equivalent to only putting healthy food on the menu because unhealthy food tastes good but might kill you. Remember, this was his argument against the fiduciary rule. So not surprisingly, Trump and his ilk are encouraging retirement savers to invest in junk food, which makes sense considering Trump is the junk food of presidents. Trump met with Wall Street's finest on Friday, better known as the Swamp if you were keeping track. Reportedly, Trump told Steven Schwarzman, head of Blackstone, one of the world's largest private equity firms, that, quote, "We're getting rid of your regulations." On an analysis call made last month, Schwarzman said that one of his dreams is his desire to have more access to retail asset products. Not quite a Martin Luther King Jr. speech, but I guess we all have dreams. If Schwarzman's dreams come true, he'll have access to the $6.8 trillion market in retirement plans like 401ks and realize the American dream of being able to screw over the elderly without consequence. Critics warn that private equity is much riskier than traditional 401k plans and that fees are higher and less transparent. A 2014 study by the SEC found that over half of private equity firms shifted costs to benefit themselves over their clients. This including forcing investors to hire consultants who were former employees of the firm. So if you're still with us, you figured out that this is basically an old school racket intended to defraud your grandpa. To promote his plan with the young, Schwarzman addressed his old high school, telling the students that if they believe in themselves, someday they can grow up and invest in a high-yield, complex financial institution with a 9% annual fee and no opt-out clause.
It's only been 2 weeks and the country is already getting swept up in impeachment fever for Donald Trump. A poll conducted by Public Policy Polling found that 40% of American voters already want impeachment proceedings against Trump. In the same poll, only 48% were opposed to the idea of impeachment, while 52% said they would rather have Barack Obama back as president. It's worth noting that public policy polling is typically hired by Democratic organizations to conduct polling. But Nate Silver, the polling guru who runs 538.com, gave the polling group a B+ rating according to their methodology. So it can't be dismissed out of hand. The poll did find that Americans were pretty split on the recent Muslim ban, with only 47% supporting it and 49% opposed to it. But it looks like as though the impeachment talk isn't enough yet to stir Congress into action. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi said on Monday that there are currently no grounds for impeachment against the president. She was responding to comments made by Democratic Representative Maxine Waters of California, who said that her greatest desire was to lead Trump right into impeachment. Pelosi said that while the president has been reckless and incompetent, he hasn't done anything criminal to get him removed from office. Waters corrected herself, saying that she is not calling for impeachment yet, but believes that he will eventually put himself in a position to be charged. Trump responded by commencing construction on a condo complex located on the White House lawn.
A recent UN report claims that the number of child casualties as a result of the Afghan war increased in 2016. The report by the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan said that the childhood death rose 24% over the previous year. Many of the deaths occurred from children stepping on unexploded bombs left behind from the war. The report also showed a 3% increase in total casualties in Afghanistan, the highest total since the U.S. began documenting deaths in 2009. Of the 11,418 casualties, 3,512 were children. Children also represented 84% of deaths caused by, quote, explosive remnants of war. Many children in Afghanistan lack any education related to unexploded mines and often pick them up out of curiosity. Others look for scrap metal to sell, leading them to unwittingly pick up an active explosive. The UN report urged steps to minimize the use of explosives in civilian areas, such as mortars, rockets, and grenades. Injuries can also lead to blindness and deformities that can lead to difficulties in receiving education later in life, which creates problems in the future when these children are expected to be the breadwinners in their homes.
The UN's top official on refugees is speaking out against a proposal to establish so-called safe zones in Syria. Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, says that the safe zones are a waste of time because there's no way to ensure safety in war-torn Syria. He said that the leaders should instead focus on making peace so that the country as a whole can be safe. Donald Trump has raised the issue of creating safe zones as a substitute for resettling refugees around the world. He has discussed the safe zone idea with King Abdullah of Jordan, who currently houses about 600,000 Syrian refugees. Turkey and Lebanon, two other countries who have taken in large numbers of refugees, also like the idea of safe zones. Grandi also spoke about Trump's Muslim ban, calling it a dangerous weakening of the established international agreement to protect refugees. Also, why rich countries couldn't take in more refugees, considering that countries like Lebanon have taken in over 1 million refugees over the past 3 years.
The head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is warning that tearing up the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, would have devastating consequences to both the Mexican and Canadian economies. Thomas Donahue told a crowd in Ottawa on Monday that the move would negatively impact workers, businesses, and the economy of Canada. Donald Trump has said that he wants to renegotiate the deal, but if he doesn't get what he wants, then he would be willing to throw the whole agreement out. Canada and Mexico send a majority of their exports to the U.S., which has caused Canadian leaders to remind the U.S. how much the two economies are linked. Donahue didn't criticize Trump in his speech, but rather singled out the NAFTA deal. Normally, the chamber tends to be more sympathetic to the Republican Party, so it was unusual to hear its leader call out a Republican president. At the end of his speech, Donahue further surprised the crowd by revealing a Resist t-shirt and placing a pussy hat atop his balding head. This was Ania Quintella
And Zaira Olivier for 5 on 20 News.
Next up, Zaira talks local politics.
Good evening and welcome again to Adelante Tucson, Tucson's new platform for unapologetic political analysis. I am your host, Zaira Olivier.
And I'm your co-host, Stephanie Koch.
I would like to begin today by commemorating the memory of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin would have been 22 years old this past Sunday. Trayvon was shot and killed by George Zimmerman on the 26th of February in 2012, just a few weeks after turning 17 while he was walking home from the convenience store. After spotting Trayvon walking just while being black, Zimmerman followed him, harassed him, and eventually shot and killed him. Trayvon was found to be carrying a bag of Skittles and an Arizona iced tea. No charges were immediately filed. After months of petitions and internal investigations, including a special investigation by the FBI, charges were finally brought against Zimmerman on April 11, 2012. On July 13, 2013, Zimmerman was found not guilty. Massive protests and countless movements followed the shooting. Notably, Zimmerman's acquittal inspired a Facebook post that included the phrase "Black Lives Matter," which later became the name for the Black Lives Matter movement. Trayvon's parents have released a book titled "Rest in Power: The Enduring Life of Trayvon Martin." We would like to thank them for their activism and for their perseverance under such tragic and unjust circumstances. Thank you.
Betsy DeVos has been confirmed as Secretary of Education in an unprecedented Senate vote, where Vice President Pence delivered the tie-breaking vote. DeVos has absolutely zero experience in the education system, but that comes only as an afterthought to Republican lawmakers since she has donated over $200 million to the GOP, who have now put her in charge of America's last remaining jewels, our public education system. DeVos is a billionaire and has been a staunch advocate for school choice and for voucher programs with deep ties to the Reformed Christian community. This is to say, DeVos believes the U.S. education system should be opened up to for-profit charter schools and has also worked to strip teacher unions of their influence. Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, called DeVos the most ideological anti-public education nominee. The founding of the cabinet-level position over 4 decades ago. DeVos has stated that education is a closed system, a closed industry, a closed market. It's a monopoly, a dead end. Yes, according to this billionaire, our education system should be a market to be exploited. This logic proposes that using public funding to open up our public education system to capitalists will offer parents increased choices, yet it doesn't take a genius to understand that this is just another guise to drive for the defunding of our public schools and push for the privatization of our education system. Now, to determine the immediate effects of privatization, we need only take a look at DeVos's home state of Michigan, where the DeVos family has been the leading financial and political backers of the school choice effort. Michigan is one of the nation's biggest school choice laboratories, as the state sent $1 billion in education funding to charters annually, 80% of which are privately owned. As charters expanded, the state's rank has fallen on national reading and math tests. A federal review in 2015 found that an unreasonably high percentage of charter schools are also on the list of Michigan's lowest performing schools.
Prior to today's vote, we saw a massive nationwide effort to persuade Republican senators to block DeVos's nomination after it was announced that Republican Senators Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine would break with their party and vote against her confirmation. Here in Arizona, Senator Jeff Flake and Senator John McCain were rumored to have been open to public opinion, which led to a flooding of calls and emails by constituents, the large majority of whom opposed DeVos's confirmation. To the disappointment of many, but to no one's surprise, the two Republican autocrats decided that the future of our education system should be led by a billionaire who seeks to destroy it by opening it up as a for-profit market. Clearly, their only priority is to defend the interests of their biggest funders. The people's interest is not of much importance to them. Constituents are only valuable when it's time to exploit their votes. Party politics is all these politicians understand, but to be fair, this isn't a trait only found on the Republican side of the aisle. Again, this should come to no one's surprise. Both Flake and McCain endorsed Donald Trump through the bigotry, through the hate, through the misogyny, and through the never-ending ignorance of his campaign. Jeff Flake reminds me of a saying, how does it go? Oh yeah, once a tool, always a tool. And McCain, oh John McCain, since your loss of in 2008, the only thing you have been good for is obstruction. So please, save us all a headache and just resign.
In unsurprising news, Trump's appointee Ajit Pai, chair of the Federal Communications Commission, has already begun attacking net neutrality rules and protections for consumers. Pai, a former Washington lawyer who's worked for the Senate, the Justice Department, the FCC, and Verizon, has been in staunch opposition to net neutrality and industry regulations. As an FCC regulator, he consistently voted against policies and regulations that would ensure net neutrality. In December of 2016, while attending a gala, Pai said, "In the months to come, we also need to remove outdated and unnecessary regulations." And boy, did he not hesitate.
As early as last week, Pai and his Republican-controlled committee has blocked 9 companies from providing affordable high-speed internet to low-income families, withdrew the FCC support from an effort to curb the exorbitant cost of phone calls from prisons where rates can be as high as $17 for a 15-minute call, and said he disagrees with the 2015 decision to regulate the internet like a public utility. So we can see how every person appointed by this administration is a lobbyist for their prior bosses and the interests of stockholders and profits. Pai is an industry puppy who wags his tail at every whistle of his corporate overlords, even being praised by industry groups for his leadership and forward thinking. I guess privatizing and deregulating every public institution is the way to lead into certain failures.
And finally, in international news, let us briefly remember the heroic Hugo Chavez, former president of Venezuela and one of Latin America's most influential leaders of the 21st century. This past February 4th marked the 15th anniversary of the military and civic uprising that took place in Venezuela on February 4th, 1992. This military uprising was organized and led by a group of patriotic soldiers within the Venezuelan armed forces, named the Bolivarian Revolutionary Movement, and its objective was to oust the corrupt government which had historically governed in favor of the rich oligarchy and imperialist foreign interests. In order to comprehend the national importance of this state for the Venezuelan people, we must review the social and the political conditions that gave rise to the Bolivarian Revolution, which came to power in 1999 with the election of Hugo Chavez as president. By 1989, the Venezuelan government had implemented harsh and devastating neoliberal economic reforms of austerity measures, privatization of state companies and public services, the elimination of social subsidies, increased state debt, and tax cuts for the elite and rich sectors. These economic policies were recommended and imposed by US-dominated international financial institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. The catastrophic result of these economic policies had on the population that already suffered from 50% poverty and over 20% of extreme poverty rates was disastrous and inevitably led to a social uprising, mainly in the capital of Caracas, which became known as the Caracazo. During the Caracazo uprising, the corrupt, unpatriotic, and oligarchical government ordered the nation's army to shoot and massacre the Venezuelan masses who were righteously rebelling against the inhumane social and economic situation of the country. Nevertheless, among the army, there already existed a faction of patriotic soldiers led by Hugo Chavez who had been organizing for the past decade and who refused to raise their arms against the people. In 1992, it was this same organization of patriotic soldiers under the name of the Bolivarian Revolutionary Movement that led a military coup which sought to oust the criminal and corrupt government of the elites and place the social interest of the majority of the poor and working people of the country as the primary emphasis of the state. Although the coup attempt ultimately failed and the majority of the soldiers were imprisoned, by 1997, Hugo Chavez had been freed and was leading a new political party called the Fifth Republic Movement, winning thereafter the presidential elections of 1998.
Now, by 1999, the people of Venezuela had democratically approved the most progressive and socially advanced constitution of Venezuelan history. And this, in turn, has allowed the Bolivarian Revolution to radically transform and improve Venezuelan society as a long-time oil exporting economy. One of the first economic measures taken by the Bolivarian government was the nationalization of the oil industry, which has been historically controlled by multinational corporations and their political lackeys within the Venezuelan government. By using the oil revenues, the Bolivarian government has in the process brought more than a decade of measurable progress to the Venezuelan people. According to a report by the Center for Economic Policy Research, the Bolivarian Revolution nearly halved Venezuela's poverty rate, from 61% in 1997 to 32% by the end of 2011, and extreme poverty declined by 2/3, from 30% to 9% over the same period. The Venezuelan people have seen massive social investment for public services like education, healthcare, public housing, food subsidies, and pensions. At the same time, the state continues to expand the productive forces and diversify the economy in order to be less dependent on foreign imports and become a more self-sustaining economy. As part of the socialist direction of the Bolivarian Revolution, the government has also greatly emphasized promoting democratic popular control over socio-economic policies, as well as introducing communal and collective forms of social property. It is important to mention that Venezuela also leads a regional movement for the unification of Latin America. International bodies like CELAC, Communities of Latin American and Caribbean States, as well as Mercosur, South American Common Market, have shown the importance and need of a Latin American and Caribbean economic, social, and political integration. This wraps up this week's Adelante Tucson. I am Sarah Olivier.
And I'm Stephanie Cott. Join us next time on our segment on 5 on 20 News.
What's up, Tucson? I'm Anias Quintella, and here with me I have Jim Ninsel, the man behind Zona Politics, a local TV show driven by politics. How are you today, Jim?
Oh, good, Anies. Thanks for having me on here.
Of course. Can you tell me a little bit about what Zona Politics is?
Yeah, so I cover politics, science, and rock and roll for the Tucson Weekly. And for many years, I was with Arizona Public Media doing a Friday night public affairs program over there.
Sure.
And eventually we left the station, and some folks encouraged me to try to do an independent show similar to what I was doing there. And I met up with Danny over here at Brink, and we were able to put something together. We've been doing it for about a year and a half. And then we took a little bit of a break. We have a radio version that airs on KXCI right now at 5 o'clock on Sundays. We've also popped out on an AM station with the radio version, and now we're going to bring back the TV version right here on Creative Tucson. So we're
Channel
pretty
20
excited.
will be airing it, right?
Channel 20 will be airing it. So we'll have a half-hour show. We'll have guests on to talk about politics, what's going on this week. We'll have special guests with elected officials and folks like that. And, you know, for some reason, people seem suddenly interested in politics more than they were
What
before.
could have ever been the catalyst for that?
I can't imagine. But folks really want to talk about it. So we're real excited. We're going to get back in here. We're going to have members of Congress come in. We're going to have our city council members, our supervisors, our state lawmakers, and then we're going to have just kind of a back and forth with pundits and journalists and everyone else just talking about the week in review. So real excited about being able to bring it back. Can't do it just yet. I have a baby that's about to be born. My wife
congratulations.
is, let me check, make sure she hasn't texted me here. No, we're okay. So she's about to give birth any day now. And so we got to wait, get through the baby moon,
Sure.
make sure that we got the kid on a good start. And
Kind of important.
yeah,
Yeah.
gotta spend that first month
Sure.
attending to the needs of the infant so we don't kill it or something
And then
like
the
that.
needs of people trying to follow local politics.
And then
Yeah.
we can follow up and we get the show back rolling. So we're real excited about that. In the meantime, you can still hear the show on KXCI on Sunday afternoons.
Well, looking forward to it, Jim. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was great.
All right.